43 years ago, a Navy cook named Daniel Morse stood on the deck of the USS Whitfield in the Solomon Sea and proposed something that made every officer in earshot laugh. He wanted to use kitchen grease, empty fuel drums, and timing flares to create a thermal mirage that would confuse incoming Japanese torpedo bombers. The idea sounded like desperation dressed as strategy. But 3 hours later, when Squadron 47 of the Imperial Japanese Navy turned back without releasing a single torpedo, the laughter stopped. What followed was not celebration. It was silence. A silence that lasted decades. The Whitfield was a Fletcher-class destroyer operating in hostile waters during the summer of 1943. It carried 273 souls, most of them young men who had never seen the ocean before enlistment. Daniel Morse was 31 years old, older than most of the crew, a former line cook from Philadelphia who had joined the Navy after his wife died of pneumonia. He was not a tactician, he was not an engineer. He was a man who understood heat, timing, and the behavior of oil under pressure. And on the morning of August 14, 1943, that knowledge became the only thing standing between his ship and destruction. The Japanese torpedo squadron had been hunting Allied convoys for weeks. Intelligence reports placed them within striking range. The Whitfield had no air support, limited ammunition, and a damaged rudder that made evasive maneuvers impossible. When the radio operator confirmed visual contact with enemy aircraft at 0820 hours, the captain ordered all hands to battle stations. Daniel Morse was told to secure the galley and report to damage control. Instead, he went to the bridge. What he said there was recorded in the ship's log, but the entry was redacted until 1986. According to declassified testimony from Lieutenant Commander Harris, Morse spoke calmly, "Sir, if we can't outrun them and we can't outshoot them, we need to make them think we're something we're not." When asked what he meant, Morse explained that if they ignited a controlled grease fire on the aft deck and released burning oil from the drums into the water, the rising heat would distort the visual and infrared signatures of the ship. The Japanese pilots, flying low and fast, would see multiple heat sources where there should be one. They might hesitate. They might recalculate, they might turn back. The plan was not scientifically sound. It was not approved by command. It was born of desperation and the strange clarity that comes when death is no longer abstract. But Captain William Stern, a man who had lost 2 ships in the previous year, looked at Morse and said, "You have 12 minutes. That decision would haunt him for the rest of his life, not because it failed, but because it worked. And no one knew how to explain why. The crew moved with the efficiency of men who had nothing left to lose. They hauled 50-gallon drums of kitchen grease to the stern. They soaked canvas tarps in diesel fuel. They rigged timing flares to ignite in sequence, creating the illusion of secondary explosions. Morse stood at the center of it all, calling out instructions in the same tone he used when preparing meals. Not too fast. Let the heat build. Wait for the wind to shift. At 0837 hours, the first flare ignited. Black smoke poured into the sky. The grease fire roared to life, and the ocean around the Whitfield began to burn. The Japanese pilots saw it from 6 miles out. They saw a destroyer engulfed in flames, listing, dying. They saw what looked like a catastrophic engine failure, a ship already lost. And they did something that no Allied commander expected. They turned. Squadron 47 broke formation, circled once, and flew north. They did not attack. They did not investigate. They simply left, believing the Whitfield had already been claimed by the sea. When the smoke cleared, the crew stood in silence. They had not fired a shot. They had not been hit. They had survived by pretending to die. And in that moment, every man aboard understood that war is not only fought with weapons, it is fought with perception, with timing, with the desperate ingenuity of those who refuse to accept the inevitable. But the Navy did not celebrate. The Navy investigated. Because Daniel Morse's plan should not have worked, and the fact that it did raised questions no one wanted to answer. The Whitfield limped into port at Espiritu Santo 3 days later. The crew expected commendations. They expected rest. Instead, they were met by naval intelligence officers who ordered the ship quarantined and the crew confined to quarters. No one was allowed to speak about what had happened. No one was allowed to leave. For 72 hours, the men who had survived Squadron 47 were treated not as heroes, but as witnesses to something that needed to be contained. Daniel Morse was separated from the rest of the crew and taken to a Quonset hut at the edge of the base. The interrogation began at 1400 hours on August 17, 1943, and lasted 9 hours. The transcript, declassified in 1986, reveals the Navy's confusion. They wanted to know how a cook with no tactical training had conceived a plan that violated every principle of naval engagement. They wanted to know if he had prior knowledge of Japanese tactics. They wanted to know if the success had been luck or something more dangerous, improvisation that could not be replicated or controlled. Morse answered every question with the same calm precision he had shown on the bridge. He explained the thermodynamics of burning oil. He explained how heat distortion affects visual targeting at low altitudes. He explained that he had learned these principles not from manuals, but from years of watching grease fires in commercial kitchens, from understanding how smoke moves, how metal conducts heat, how timing determines whether a fire spreads or dies. The officers listened in silence. They took notes, and when the interrogation ended, Morse was told he would receive a commendation for bravery, but that the details of his plan would remain classified indefinitely. The reason for the classification was not stated in the official record, but a memo from the Office of Naval Research, dated August 20th, 1943, makes the logic clear. If Morse's method is validated and disseminated, it will encourage improvisation among enlisted personnel in situations where established protocol exists. This introduces unpredictability into command structure and undermines the principle of hierarchical decision-making. Recommend suppression of details and restriction of commendation to standard heroism citation. In other words, the Navy was not afraid that Morse's plan had failed. They were afraid that it had worked and that others might try similar improvisation. The military machine runs on predictability. It runs on chains of command, on tested procedures, on the assumption that enlisted men follow orders rather than invent solutions. Morse had violated that assumption, and in doing so, he had revealed a truth the Navy did not want acknowledged, that survival sometimes requires disobedience, that innovation often comes from those who are not trained to think within acceptable limits. The crew of the Whitfield was sworn to secrecy. They were reassigned to different ships, different theaters, different fates. Most of them never spoke about August 14, 1943, even to their families. Daniel Morse returned to the galley. He cooked for the remainder of the war. He never proposed another plan. He never sought recognition. When the war ended, he returned to Philadelphia, opened a diner, and lived quietly until his death in 1979. He never gave interviews. He never wrote a memoir. The only record of his voice is the interrogation transcript. And even there, he sounds like a man who understood that some victories are too dangerous to celebrate. But the story did not end with silence, because someone, somewhere, had been listening. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested in knowing how far and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In 1952, 9 years after the incident, a physicist named Dr. Robert Kellerman submitted a classified research proposal to the Office of Naval Research. The title was obscure: Thermal Signature Manipulation in Maritime Combat Scenarios. The content was not. Kellerman had somehow obtained fragments of the Whitfield interrogation transcripts and had reverse-engineered Morse's improvised tactic into a formal scientific framework. He proposed a series of controlled experiments to test whether deliberate heat distortion could be weaponized, not as a last resort, but as standard doctrine. The proposal was remarkable for two reasons. First, it demonstrated that Morse's instinct had been scientifically sound. The rising heat from burning oil and grease created a thermal layer that disrupted infrared targeting systems and caused visual distortion at specific altitudes and approach angles. The Japanese pilots had not turned back because they believed the ship was destroyed. They had turned back because their instruments no longer provided reliable data. The Whitfield had become invisible, not through stealth, but through controlled chaos. Second, Kellerman's proposal revealed that the Navy had been studying the incident far more closely than anyone had admitted. Someone in naval intelligence had preserved every detail of Morse's plan. Someone had run simulations. Someone had recognized that what happened in the Solomon Sea was not luck. It was a repeatable phenomenon. And someone had decided that this knowledge was too valuable to ignore and too dangerous to share. The Office of Naval Research approved Kellerman's proposal with two conditions. The research would be conducted under classified protocols, and the name Daniel Morse would never appear in any documentation. The official reasoning was operational security. The real reason, evident in internal memos, was reputation management. If it became known that a Navy cook had invented a tactic that trained officers had missed, it would raise uncomfortable questions about the value of formal education, about who gets to innovate, about whose ideas are taken seriously. Kellerman conducted his experiments at a remote testing facility in the Pacific. He used decommissioned destroyers, controlled fires, and aircraft equipped with period-accurate targeting systems. The results confirmed everything Morse had intuited. Thermal distortion worked. It worked consistently. It worked well enough that by 1954, elements of Morse's improvised tactic had been incorporated into naval evasion protocols, without attribution, without acknowledgement, without any public record of where the idea had originated. But Kellerman was not satisfied with silence. In his private journals, recovered after his death in 1989, he wrote, "We have taken the work of a man who acted on instinct and transformed it into doctrine. We have made it ours. But every time a ship uses this protocol, it is Daniel Morse's ghost on the bridge, and we pretend not to see him." The journals also contained something unexpected: correspondence with Captain William Stern, the commanding officer of the Whitfield. Stern had been forced into early retirement in 1945, officially due to stress-related health concerns. The real reason, evident in the letters, was that he had continued to advocate for Morse's commendation and had refused to accept the Navy's classification of the incident. In one letter dated 1953, Stern wrote, "They are building careers on what that man did, and he is frying eggs in Philadelphia. This is not honor. This is theft." Kellerman never responded to that letter, but he kept it. And when his journals were declassified decades later, it became clear that the guilt had followed him. He had benefited from Morse's ingenuity. He had turned improvisation into science, instinct into protocol. And in doing so, he had erased the man who made it possible. The Shadow Report, Kellerman's final unpublished analysis, was found among his effects in 1989. It contained a single recommendation: acknowledge Daniel Morse posthumously, not for bravery, for innovation. Because the war was won not only by those who followed orders, but by those who refused to accept that death was inevitable. The recommendation was never implemented. The report was archived. And Daniel Morse remained, as he had always been, invisible. In 1961, 18 years after the incident, a junior historian named Margaret Fielding was assigned to compile a comprehensive history of unconventional naval tactics during World War II. Her mandate was broad: document any instance where standard protocol had been abandoned in favor of improvisation, and assess whether those improvisations had influenced post-war doctrine. She worked methodically, interviewing veterans, cross-referencing ship logs, and requesting declassification of operational reports. It was during this process that she encountered a redacted entry in the August 1943 action reports from the Southwest Pacific Theater. USS Whitfield, incident suppressed pending review. Fielding submitted a formal request for the full report. She was denied. She appealed. She was denied again. She contacted retired officers who had served in the region. Most refused to speak. One, a former gunnery officer named Thomas Brennan, agreed to meet her off the record. What he told her in a diner in San Diego in 1962 was never included in any official history, but Fielding's personal notes, donated to the Naval History Archive in 2003, preserved his account. Brennan had not been aboard the Whitfield, but he had been stationed at Espiritu Santo when the ship arrived. He remembered the quarantine. He remembered the interrogation. He remembered the rumor that spread among the enlisted men, that a cook had saved an entire ship using nothing but kitchen supplies and nerve. "We thought it was a joke," Brennan said. "Then we saw the officers' faces, and we knew it wasn't." He also remembered something else. A captain from Naval Intelligence who told the base personnel that the Whitfield incident was an anomaly that must not be mythologized. Fielding pressed him on what that meant. Brennan hesitated, then said they were afraid it would give people ideas, that if one cook could outsmart a Japanese squadron, then maybe the system wasn't as smart as it claimed to be. Maybe the men at the bottom knew something the men at the top didn't. And that was dangerous, not to the enemy, to the chain of command. Fielding wanted to interview Daniel Morse. She located him in Philadelphia, wrote him a letter, and received no response. She wrote again. Still nothing. She visited his diner in 1963. Morse was polite but firm. He had no interest in discussing the war. He had no interest in being part of any history. "I did what needed doing," he told her. "That's all." When she explained that his tactic had influenced modern naval doctrine, he showed no emotion. When she said he deserved recognition, he looked at her and said, "Recognition doesn't bring back the men who didn't make it, and it doesn't change what we had to become to survive." Fielding left the diner with nothing, but she did not give up. She continued to gather evidence, fragments of the interrogation transcript, Kellerman's proposal, letters from Captain Stern, testimony from crew members who had been reassigned. By 1965, she had assembled a full reconstruction of the incident. She submitted it as a chapter in her larger study. The Office of Naval History rejected it. The official reason was insufficient corroboration. The real reason, evident in a tersely worded internal memo, was that the chapter undermines institutional credibility by suggesting that untrained personnel can outperform trained officers. Fielding revised the chapter, removing any suggestion of failure by command and emphasizing Morse's bravery rather than his ingenuity. It was rejected again. She was told that the Whitfield incident would not be included in any official history at this time. Muddy. When she asked when that might change, she was told, when it no longer matters. She resigned from the project in 1966. Her notes were filed away. The history she had compiled was never published. And for another 20 years, the story of Daniel Morse remained locked in redacted files and fading memories. But something had shifted. Fielding's inquiries had drawn attention. Her requests for declassification had created a paper trail. And in the bureaucratic machinery of the military, paper trails do not disappear. They accumulate, waiting for the moment when someone decides that silence has lasted long enough. That moment came in 1986, when a congressional subcommittee on military transparency ordered the declassification of World War II operational records that no longer posed a security risk. Among the thousands of documents released was the full interrogation transcript of Daniel Morse, the shadow report of Dr. Robert Kellerman and Margaret Fielding's rejected chapter. The story, after 43 years, finally became public. By then, Daniel Morse had been dead for 7 years. He never knew that his name had been cleared. He never knew that his plan had become doctrine. He never knew that the silence had finally broken, and perhaps in some way that was fitting. Because Daniel Morse had never sought recognition. He had sought survival for himself, for his crew, for the men who trusted him when no one else would. The war ended, but the silence lasted longer. The declassification of the Whitfield documents in 1986 did not result in headlines. There were no televised retrospectives, no medals awarded posthumously, no public acknowledgement from the Navy. The files were released as part of a larger batch, buried among thousands of other operational reports. Historians noticed. Veterans noticed. But the broader public did not. The story of Daniel Morse remained what it had always been, a footnote, a curiosity, a reminder that the most important moments in war are often the ones no one wants to remember. But within the Navy, the release had consequences. Officers who had studied evasion tactics suddenly understood the origin of protocols they had been trained to execute without question. Scientists who had built careers on thermal signature research found themselves confronting the uncomfortable fact that their work had been based on the improvisation of a man with no formal education. And veterans who had served in the Pacific began to speak quietly about other moments when survival had depended on someone breaking the rules. One of those veterans was Lieutenant Commander Harris, the officer who had recorded Morse's proposal in the ship's log. He was 81 years old in 1986, living in a retirement community in Virginia. When a local newspaper asked him about the declassified documents, he agreed to an interview. What he said was brief, but it carried the weight of decades. Morse saved us, not because he knew more than the rest of us, but because he wasn't afraid to be wrong. The rest of us were trained to follow procedure, and procedure would have gotten us killed. He wasn't trained, so he wasn't trapped. That single statement encapsulated the dilemma the Navy had faced in 1943 and continued to face in 1986. How to balance discipline with innovation, obedience with ingenuity, protocol with survival. The military depends on predictability. It depends on the assumption that orders will be followed, that training will be trusted, that the system works. But the Whitfield incident revealed a fracture in that assumption, a moment when the system failed and a man without authority stepped forward with a solution the system could not have produced. The Navy's response to that fracture had been suppression, not out of malice but out of fear. Fear that if Morse's story became widely known, it would encourage others to question orders, to improvise in situations where improvisation might lead to disaster. Fear that the military machine, which runs on hierarchy and obedience, would be weakened by the idea that genius can come from the galley as easily as from the bridge. But suppression has a cost. Captain William Stern paid that cost. He spent the final decades of his life fighting for recognition that never came, advocating for a man who never asked for it. Dr. Robert Kellerman paid that cost. He built a career on research that he knew was not his, and the guilt followed him to the grave. Margaret Fielding paid that cost. She spent years compiling a history that was rejected, not because it was inaccurate, but because it was inconvenient. And Daniel Morse paid that cost. He lived quietly, fried eggs, served coffee, and died without ever knowing that the plan he improvised in 12 desperate minutes had become foundational to naval doctrine. He was not a hero in the way the Navy defines heroism. He did not charge into battle. He did not die for his country. He simply refused to accept that death was inevitable, and in refusing, he saved 273 lives. The price of innovation, it turns out, is often invisibility. The price of survival is often silence. And the price of breaking the rules is that history will remember the system, but not the man who proved the system was not enough. If this story surprised you, go ahead and leave a like to help the channel. In 1994, 11 years after the declassification, a retired Navy commander named Victor Ashford published a tactical analysis titled Improvisation and Doctrine: Lessons from the Pacific Theater. The paper was not widely read, but among those who did read it were officers responsible for training the next generation of naval personnel. Ashford's central argument was provocative. The Navy had spent decades codifying Morse's improvised tactic into formal protocol, but in doing so, it had stripped away the very quality that made the tactic effective: spontaneity. Ashford argued that thermal distortion works not because it is a repeatable procedure, but because it is unexpected. The Japanese pilots turned back in 1943, not because they encountered a known countermeasure, but because they encountered something that did not fit their understanding of naval combat. Once thermal distortion became doctrine, once it was included in training manuals and operational handbooks, it ceased to be a surprise. It became predictable. And predictability, Ashford wrote, is the enemy of innovation. He interviewed former crew members of the Whitfield, now in their 70s and 80s. Most of them remembered August 14, 1943, not as a moment of tactical brilliance, but as a moment of sheer terror in which a cook had said something insane, and the captain had been desperate enough to listen. "It wasn't a plan," one former machinist's mate said. "It was chaos with a timer. And it worked because the Japanese didn't know what the hell we were doing. Neither did we." Ashford's conclusion was uncomfortable. The lesson of the Whitfield was not that improvisation should be codified, but that it should be protected. That the military should create space for the kind of lateral thinking that comes from people who are not trained to think in terms of protocol. That the next Daniel Morse might not come from the bridge, but from the engine room, the galley, the radar station, from the places where people are not taught to command, only to obey. The paper was discussed in a handful of war colleges. It was cited in a few academic journals, but it did not change policy, because Ashford's argument, however sound, threatened the fundamental structure of military hierarchy. If innovation comes from the bottom, then what is the value of the top? If survival depends on disobedience, then what is the value of discipline? These were questions the Navy could not answer without dismantling the very system that made the Navy function. But Ashford's paper did have one unexpected effect. It inspired a small, informal group of officers and historians to begin compiling what they called the Ghost Protocol, a classified database of improvised tactics used by enlisted personnel during World War II that had never been officially recognized. The Whitfield incident was the first entry. Over the next decade, more than 50 other cases were documented. A radio operator who invented a false transmission protocol to mislead German U-boats, a medic who used engine coolant as a surgical disinfectant, a quartermaster who turned cargo netting into an improvised anti-aircraft screen. None of these tactics had been planned, none had been approved, none had come from officers trained in tactical doctrine, but all of them had worked, and all of them had been suppressed. Not because they were failures, but because they were successes that could not be explained within the framework of military protocol. The Ghost Protocol was never officially acknowledged. It remains to this day an informal archive maintained by a rotating group of officers who believe that the history of war is incomplete without the stories of those who broke the rules to survive. The name itself is a tribute to Daniel Morse, a man who became a ghost in his own story, whose ingenuity was adopted, adapted, and erased. In 2003, 24 years after Morse's death, the Navy opened a small exhibit at the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington, D.C. The exhibit was titled Unconventional Tactics: Innovation Under Fire. It included a brief mention of the Whitfield incident and a photograph of Daniel Morse in his cook's uniform, standing on the deck of the ship he saved. The caption read, "Petty Officer Daniel Morse, whose quick thinking under pressure exemplified the resourcefulness of the American sailor." The exhibit ran for 6 months. Attendance was modest. The photograph of Morse drew little attention, and when the exhibit closed, the materials were returned to storage. But for those 6 months, Daniel Morse was visible. His name was spoken. His story was told. And for those who paused to read the caption, there was a moment of recognition that the man in the photograph, standing quietly in his galley uniform, had done something that trained officers could not have done, that formal doctrine could not have produced, that the Navy could not acknowledge without admitting that the system was not enough. The ghost protocol remains. The stories remain. And somewhere in the archives, between the official histories and the redacted files, Daniel Morse is still standing on the deck of the Whitfield, watching the smoke rise, waiting for the enemy to turn back, knowing that survival is not always a matter of strength or training or firepower. Sometimes it is simply a matter of refusing to believe that death is inevitable. The story of Daniel Morse ends not with triumph, but with silence. He returned to Philadelphia, opened a diner, and lived the rest of his life as though August 14th, 1943, had never happened. He did not seek recognition. He did not write about the war. When veterans gathered to trade stories, he listened but did not speak. His wife had died before the war. He never remarried. He had no children. When he died in 1979, the funeral was small. The obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer mentioned that he had served in the Navy during World War II, but it did not mention the Whitfield. It did not mention Squadron 47. It did not mention the 12 minutes that saved 273 lives. The men who survived because of him scattered across the country. Most of them lived into old age. Some of them spoke about the incident after the declassification, but their accounts were fragmentary, shaped by decades of silence and the fading clarity of memory. They remembered the smoke. They remembered the heat. They remembered standing on the deck waiting to die and then watching the Japanese planes turn away. But few of them remembered the moment when Daniel Morse walked onto the bridge and said something that no one believed would work. Captain William Stern died in 1991, 12 years after Morse. In his final years, he gave a single interview to a military historian. The recording, archived at the Naval War College, captures an old man's voice, quiet, deliberate, haunted. He spoke about many things, but when the interviewer asked about the Whitfield, Stern paused for a long time before answering. Then he said, "I gave the order. But it was Morse's idea, and the Navy took it from him. They took it and made it theirs, and he never said a word. He just went back to the galley and kept cooking. That's the kind of man he was, and that's why no one remembers him." The interviewer asked if Stern regretted giving the order. Stern's response was immediate. "I regret that I couldn't make them see what I saw. That improvisation isn't chaos. That genius doesn't always come from the academy. That the men we train to follow orders are also capable of giving them, if we let them." He died 6 months later. His obituary mentioned his service, his decorations, his command of multiple ships. It did not mention the Whitfield. It did not mention Daniel Morse. Dr. Robert Kellerman, the physicist who turned Morse's improvisation into doctrine, left behind a final letter. It was found in his desk after his death in 1989, addressed to no one. It read, "I have spent my career studying what Daniel Morse understood in 12 minutes. I have written papers. I have received commendations. I have trained officers in the use of thermal distortion protocols, and every time I do, I think of the man whose name will never appear in the footnotes. Science is built on the shoulders of giants, but sometimes the giants are invisible." The letter was never sent. It was archived with his personal effects, and like so much of the Whitfield story, it became part of the Ghost Protocol, a record of what was known but not acknowledged, what was used but not credited, what was essential but never celebrated. In 2019, 76 years after the incident, a filmmaker named Sarah Kellner attempted to produce a documentary about the Whitfield. She conducted interviews with surviving family members of the crew, reviewed declassified documents, and visited the Philadelphia diner that Morse had owned. The building was still standing, converted into a coffee shop. The new owners had no idea that the man who built it had once saved a Navy destroyer using kitchen grease and timing flares. Kellner's documentary was never completed. She could not secure funding. The story, she was told, was too obscure, too technical, too difficult to visualize. The incident lacked the dramatic arc that audiences expected from war stories. There were no explosions, no heroic charges, just smoke, silence, and a squadron that turned back. But for those who know the story, the Whitfield represents something essential about war and survival, that the most important victories are often the ones that are never seen, that the men who save lives are not always the ones who fire the guns, that improvisation is not a failure of discipline. It is the last desperate act of those who refuse to accept that the system has no answer. Daniel Morse did not die a hero. He died a cook, and perhaps that is the truest ending to his story, because heroism, in the way the Navy defines it, is visible, decorated, remembered. But survival, real survival, is often invisible, undecorated, forgotten. It is the sound of oil burning on the water, the sight of smoke rising into the sky, the moment when the enemy turns back, not because they were defeated, but because they were confused. It is the voice of a man in a galley uniform, standing on a bridge, saying something that no one believes, and being right. The war ended. The files were declassified. The protocols were updated. And Daniel Morse, who saved 273 lives with 12 minutes and a desperate idea, remained what he had always been. A man who cooked, who served, who lived quietly, and who understood that the greatest victories are the ones that history forgets. The steel still holds the sound of what should not have been forged. But it also holds the sound of survival. The sound of one man's refusal to accept the inevitable, the sound of ingenuity in the face of death, the sound of a cook who became, for 12 minutes, the savior of a ship that the Navy could not save. And in the silence that followed, in the decades of suppression and the slow release of truth, one fact remains. Daniel Morse's idea worked. And because it worked, the Navy learned. Not from doctrine, not from officers, but from a man who understood heat, timing, and the behavior of oil under pressure. A man who proved that genius does not require rank, that survival does not require permission, and that sometimes the most important voices are the ones the system is trained not to hear. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and unsettling cases. Thank you for following the story of Daniel Morse. See you in the next video.